when my son's future father-in-law pointed at me across the dinner table and said, "I don't know why Miles even invited you. You're not family. You're just the guy who raised him." I didn't say a word, but when he walked into my son's kitchen 30 minutes later and saw what was hanging on the wall, he went completely white and couldn't finish his sentence. I should back up. My son Miles called me on a Tuesday in late September, which was unusual because Miles normally texts. He's 34, works in commercial real estate in Atlanta, and has his mother's habit of communicating everything in short bursts, a thumbs up here, a two-word reply there. A phone call meant something was happening. Dad. His voice had that particular tightness I'd learned to recognize over 3 decades, the same tightness he had at 7 when he broke the garage window, at 16 when he wrecked my truck on Poplar Road, and at 22 when he told me he dropped out of his MBA program. I need to tell you something. I was sitting in my kitchen in Decatur reading the morning edition with my second cup of coffee going cold beside me. Retired 2 years now after 31 years with the Georgia Bureau of Investigation, and I still woke up at 5:15 every morning out of pure habit. Old dogs. "Go ahead," I said. "I'm engaged." The newspaper didn't slip from my hands like some dramatic scene. I just set it down carefully on the table and picked up my coffee mug, found it cold, and set it back down. "To whom?" I asked. "Her name is Ingrid Ashworth." He paused. "I know what you're going to say." "You don't know what I'm going to say. You're going to ask how long we've been together." He wasn't wrong. How long? 5 weeks. I looked out my kitchen window at the neighbor's oak tree, which had just started turning. 5 weeks. In my experience, and I had a great deal of it, people who made permanent decisions after 5 weeks were either very lucky or setting themselves up for a long, painful education. "Miles," I said. "Dad, I know how it sounds. Does she know what you do for a living?" "Yes." "Does she know what I did?" A pause. "Shorter than I expected. I mentioned you were retired law enforcement. I didn't get into specifics. I noted that, not because I thought it mattered in the way he meant, but because the instinct to omit details was interesting. Protective, maybe, or careful. Hard to tell which without more information. "When can I meet her?" I asked. "That's actually why I called." Another pause, this one heavier. "Her family wants to do a dinner. Her parents, her older brother, all of us together. Kind of a formal meet the family thing. They're very traditional." "That's reasonable. It's at their house." "In Buckhead." He said it the way people said Buckhead when they wanted you to understand something about the people who lived there. "Next Saturday, 7 o'clock. I'll be there. Dad." His voice dropped. "Her dad is. He's a certain kind of person. Very successful. He has opinions about things." I understood what my son was telling me without saying it. He was telling me to be careful. He was telling me that this man had already formed an impression of me, probably based on whatever Miles had shared, and that the impression wasn't favorable. "I'll bring wine," I said. He laughed short and surprised. "Yeah, okay, thanks, Dad." After we hung up, I sat with my cold coffee for a long time. 5 weeks. I'd arrested men for crimes they'd spent 5 weeks planning. I'd also seen couples married 50 years who said they knew after 5 days. The timeline wasn't the whole story, but it was a data point, and I'd spent 31 years taking data points seriously. I found the Ashworths in about 20 minutes of basic searching, not snooping, just the kind of background orientation I'd have done before any unfamiliar situation. Reginald Ashworth, 68, founder of a commercial property development firm headquartered in Midtown. His company had developed several mixed-use projects across the Southeast, the kind of thing you saw profiled in Atlanta Business Chronicle. His wife, Constance, sat on the boards of Two Arts Foundations. Their older son, Preston, worked at the firm. Ingrid, 29, had a graduate degree in interior design and had worked at a firm in Buckhead for the past 4 years. On the surface, a successful, established Atlanta family, nothing that explained the weight in Miles's voice. I called him back that evening. "Tell me about her father." A long exhale. "He's the kind of guy who built everything himself and wants everyone to know it. He's not mean exactly. He just He has a way of making you feel like you're being evaluated constantly. And what does his evaluation of me look like so far? Silence. Miles. He asked what you did before you retired. I told him GBI. He said, another pause. He said that explained a lot. And then he said he hoped you understood that his daughter was accustomed to a certain kind of life. I let that sit for a moment. I see. Dad, I'm not saying I know what you're saying. And I know what you're saying. And I know what he's saying. I kept my voice even. I'll be fine, son. The Saturday in question arrived gray and cool, the kind of October day that smelled like wood smoke and wet leaves. I dressed carefully, not for the Ashworths, but because I believe in showing up to any situation looking like you belong there. Navy blazer, gray slacks, the good dress shoes I'd kept polished since a sergeant in the Army taught me that you could tell everything about a man from his shoes. I brought a bottle of Pappy Van Winkle 15-year that I'd been saving since my retirement party. Not because I thought it would impress Reginald Ashworth, but because it was the right thing to bring to a man who had worked hard and built something real. You honor that, even when you don't like the man. The Ashworth house in Buckhead was the kind of place that tried to look modest and failed. Stone exterior, double front doors, a circular driveway. The landscaping was immaculate in the way that required a weekly service. Miles's car was already there, along with two others I didn't recognize. Ingrid answered the door, and whatever complicated feelings I had about the situation, I'll say this: she was warm. Genuinely warm, not performatively so. She shook my hand with both of hers and said she was so glad I could make it, and it didn't sound like something she'd rehearsed. Miles talks about you all the time, she said, taking my coat. Good things, I hope. She smiled. Mostly about how you never let him get away with anything. I liked her immediately, which made what came next harder, not easier. The living room was large and formal, the kind of room designed for impressing guests rather than sitting in. Constance Ashworth came forward first, a slender woman with silver hair and excellent posture, gracious in the way that comes from decades of practice. She accepted the bourbon with genuine appreciation and said she'd put it somewhere safe before Reggie found it. Preston was already holding a drink near the fireplace. 37, the older son, with his father's build and his mother's quieter effect. He shook my hand and said something about Miles being good people, and I thanked him for it. Reginald came in from what I assumed was his study. He was a large man, physically broad, with the energy of someone who had never fully learned to turn off the part of himself that was always working. His handshake was the kind that tries to establish something. So you're Miles's father. He said it like he was confirming a fact he'd been doubtful about. Reg Ashworth. Good to meet you, I said. Miles has told me a lot about your family. Has he? It wasn't a question. He looked me over in that particular way some men have, cataloging. He told me you were with the state. GBI, was it? That's right. He turned to take a drink from Preston, then looked back at me. 30 years? 31. Government work. He nodded slowly, like he was being generous by acknowledging it. Good pension, I imagine. And there it was, delivered in the first 90 seconds, with a smile over ice and a crystal glass. Government work. Good pension. As if those were the most charitable things he could find to say. I manage, I said. Dinner was served in the dining room, which had the kind of long table that was designed to seat 12 and feel intimate for 6. Constance had made a standing rib roast, which I noted because people reveal themselves in what they cook for strangers. A standing rib roast is serious hospitality. Whatever Reginald's issues were, his wife was trying. The meal itself was pleasant on the surface. Ingrid and Miles sat together and were clearly in love in the uncomplicated way of people who haven't yet had to make hard choices together. Constance asked me about Decatur and seemed genuinely interested in my answer. Preston was quiet and watchful in the way of someone who had spent a long time observing his father. Reginald spent the meal performing. The problem with public sector careers, he said at one point, with the manner of someone raising an interesting intellectual point, is that they create a certain comfort with limitation. You stop pushing. The ceiling's always clear. You know exactly how high you'll go, and eventually you just accept it. He glanced at me to make sure I'd registered the implication. That's one way to look at it, I said. Reg, Constance said quietly. I'm not being critical. It's just an observation. He cut into his roast with the efficiency of someone who was always slightly impatient to get to the next thing. I started with nothing, literally nothing. Father drove a delivery truck. Mother cleaned offices downtown. I built this. He gestured vaguely at the house, the table, the general circumstance of his life. Nobody handed it to me. Nobody handed in me anything either, I said. Still pleasant. Still even. He smiled the smile of someone who had already decided the point was settled. Of course not. I just think there's a different kind of drive. When you're betting your own money, when it's all on you, you develop a different edge. He looked at Miles. Your father will understand this isn't personal. Miles's jaw was tight. He was 23 again, holding the side mirror of my truck in both hands. I understand perfectly, I said. The evening might have ended there, in that polite and damaging way where nothing is quite said and everything is quite meant. But Reginald had more to give. After dinner, Constance brought out coffee and a dessert that deserved better than the conversation it accompanied. Reginald had refreshed his drink and settled into what I recognized as his preferred mode: expansive, proprietorial, unassailable. You know what I've been thinking, he said, not really asking. This merger you're looking at, Miles, the one with the Piedmont Group, I've seen that structure before. The problem with commercial real estate at your level is the same problem with government work, actually. He looked at me with what he probably thought was a collegial smile. You're always working for someone else's vision, never your own. Miles worked for himself, I said. He has his own firm. A small firm. Reginald waved it away. I'm not criticizing. You build from somewhere. I'm just saying that without serious capital behind you, without the right backing, you're always going to be playing catch-up. He leaned back. Ingrid deserves someone who can. He paused, as if choosing words, and then didn't choose carefully enough. Someone who can keep up. The table went quiet. Ingrid's face went still. Miles set down his coffee cup. Dad, Preston said, I'm not being unkind. Reginald spread his hands. I'm being honest. I think that's more respectful, frankly. I want Miles to succeed, but he's going to need to think bigger. Both of you are. He looked from Miles to me, and the look said very clearly that he had placed us in the same category, minor figures in a story he was still telling himself. No offense intended to anyone at this table. I set my own coffee cup down with the same deliberate care I'd used setting down evidence bags for 31 years. None taken, I said quietly. And then I stood up. Would anyone mind if I looked around? Ingrid mentioned the house has some architectural details worth seeing. Ingrid, to her credit, recovered instantly. Of course, I'll show you. She led me through the hallway toward the back of the house, and I followed, aware of the silence left behind us at the table. What I actually wanted and what I suspected Ingrid knew was a moment out of that room. She showed me the back sitting room, bookshelves, family photos, the comfortable clutter of a life actually lived in contrast to the formal dining room, and then she showed me a hallway lined with Reginald's professional history, framed articles, award plaques, a photograph for the groundbreaking for his first major development, circa 1993, and then something else. Hanging near the end of the hallway, slightly apart from the professional memorabilia, was a framed commendation, not the usual business award, a certificate of appreciation from the Georgia Department of Public Safety dated 2009 for significant cooperation in the successful resolution of the Hargrove financial fraud investigation. I stood in front of it for a long moment. Ingrid, I said, keeping my voice easy, do you know what your father's involvement was in the Hargrove case? She looked at the frame, then at me. He always said he helped the state catch someone who was defrauding investors. He was proud of it. Why? I didn't answer immediately. I was doing math. The Hargrove case had run 2007 to 2009. I had been the lead investigator for the GBI on the Financial Crimes Unit. The cooperation that had eventually cracked the case had come from a mid-level developer who had done business with Hargrove and provided us with internal documents we couldn't have gotten any other way. A developer based in Atlanta. I never met him in person. All the communication had gone through his attorney. But I knew the name and the commendation. I had signed the paperwork for that certificate myself. We went back to the dining room. Reginald looked up when I came in, already composing his next observation. But something in the way I walked back to my chair made him pause. I'd been told before that I had a particular manner when I had finished gathering information and was ready to use it. I'd never quite been able to see it myself, but apparently it was visible. "Reginald," I said, sitting down and picking up my coffee with the same unrushed movement I'd used to open 1,000 interviews. "I spent the last few minutes looking at your hallway." He waited. "The commendation from the Department of Public Safety, 2009. I met his eyes. The Hargrove investigation. The change in his face was not dramatic. He was a man who had learned to control his reactions. But the color shifted just slightly around the jaw, and his eyes did what eyes always do. They moved, briefly, to something he wasn't trying to look at. "What about it?" he said. "I was the lead investigator on that case," I said. "GBI Financial Crimes Unit, 31 years of government work." I said it the same way he had earlier, but gently, without heat. "Your cooperation was essential. The documents you provided were the basis for the indictments." Nobody at the table said anything. Preston had gone very still. Constance was looking at her husband with an expression I recognized. The expression of a person who knows more than they've been saying. "I never met you in person," I continued. "Everything went through your attorney, so you wouldn't have recognized me. But I knew your name the moment Miles told me." Reginald was quiet for a moment that lasted a long time. When he finally spoke, his voice had lost the expansive quality it had carried all evening. "You knew," he said, "when you came in. I confirmed it just now." I looked at him directly. "I'm not here as an investigator, Reginald. I'm here as Manala's father. What you did in 2009 took courage. Cooperating against Hargrove wasn't without risk to you, professionally and otherwise. You did it anyway. I've always respected that. It is a strange thing to watch a man of his particular size and certainty recalibrate in real time." He set down his drink. His posture changed. Not collapsed. He wasn't the collapsing kind, but adjusted, like something had been relieved of pressure. "You never knew who provided the cooperation," he said. More statement than question. "By design," I said. "We protected your identity throughout the process. Your attorney ensured that." I paused. "Miles doesn't know any of this, neither does Ingrid. I'm telling you, and only you, because I think you deserve to know that the man who built the case you helped us build is sitting at your dinner table, and I think it changes something." He looked at Miles, then at me, then at the table for a long moment. "I said some things tonight," he said finally, "that I don't entirely stand behind." "People say things," I said. "Reg," Constance said softly. "Just his name." But the whole history of their marriage was in it. He cleared his throat, the sound of a large man who was unaccustomed to being caught off balance. "Miles." He turned to my son, who was watching him with an expression carefully neutral in the way of someone who had been surprised before and was managing his expectations. "I've been," he stopped. "Tried again. I've been measuring you by standards that weren't entirely fair. I think you know what I mean." Miles was quiet. I watched him decide in real time whether to let his father-in-law off the hook. He is his mother's son in some ways, her warmth, her directness, and his father's in others. He has my instinct for when a concession is genuine. "I appreciate that," Miles said. And your father." Reginald looked at me with something I hadn't seen on his face all evening. "Not respect, exactly. More like the adjustment that comes when a man discovers the landscape he thought he knew has different features than he mapped. I owe you an apology." "Several, actually. You don't," I said. but I'll take the bourbon back if you prefer." That made Preston laugh, short and surprised. Constance covered her mouth, and Reginald Ashworth, who had spent the better part of 3 hours informing the table what he had built and who he was, made a sound that was, unmistakably, a laugh. The rest of the evening was different, not transformed into something it wasn't. We were still strangers at a table, still navigating the particular awkwardness of families being assembled from parks that didn't choose each other. But the performance stopped. Reginald asked me about the Hargrove case with genuine curiosity, wanting to understand how the investigation had worked, what we had actually built, and how. I told him what I could. He told me things about that period of his career. He clearly hadn't told many people. The pressure he'd been under, what it had cost him to make the call his attorney had advised him against. It was, in the end, an honest conversation between two men who had both spent a long time doing difficult work in different rooms of the same building. Driving home through Atlanta at 11 o'clock, the highway quiet and orange lit, I thought about what Miles had said when we talked on the sidewalk before I left. He'd walked me to my car, his hands in his pockets, and we stood in the cool air while the house glowed behind us. "You knew the whole time," he said. "I confirmed it while you were at the table. Is that why you didn't push back?" He made a gesture that covered the whole evening. "I pushed back when it was useful," I said. "The rest wasn't worth the energy." He was quiet for a moment. "Mom always said you were the most patient person she'd ever met. Said it was maddening." She wasn't wrong. He put his hand on my shoulder briefly, the way men do when they mean something they don't quite have words for. "Thanks for coming, Dad." I drove home the long way, past the stretch of Ponce de Leon where I'd worked my first case out of the GBI field office in 1993, past the neighborhood where Miles had learned to ride his bike on a cracked sidewalk in front of a house we couldn't quite afford, past the quiet streets of Decatur where the oak trees were dropping their leaves in the October dark. I'd spent 31 years in government work. I'd never built a building or put my name on a development or made the kind of money that paid for a circular driveway and double front doors. What I'd built was harder to see and easier to forget. Case files, convictions, the long, slow architecture of accountability. And sometimes, without planning it, you walk into a room and it's already there. All the work you did, all the invisible structure, holding up things you didn't even know you'd made. Miles sent me a text at midnight, just 2 words. She said yes. I already knew what he meant. He wasn't talking about the engagement. I've been thinking about that hallway a lot since that night. Not the commendation on the wall, the work itself. The years behind it, the thing Reginald never knew he was dismissing when he said government work and good pension with that particular smile, the one that meant he'd already decided what I was worth before I'd finished sitting down. He wasn't a bad man. I want to be clear about that. I've spent 31 years learning the difference between people who are bad and people who are just unexamined. Reginald had built something real. He'd earned the right to be proud of it. But somewhere along the way he'd confused his accomplishments with a measuring stick, and he'd started holding it up to everyone he met, without asking whether it was the right tool for the job. What I keep coming back to is this. He had this certificate on his wall. He'd done something genuinely courageous in 2009, something that cost him professionally and that he'd done anyway because it was right. That was the man underneath the performance. I saw it. I recognized it before he did that night. That's the thing about character. It accumulates quietly. You make a decision in a hard moment. You cooperate when you could look the other way. You hold your tongue when pushing back would feel satisfying. You show up to a dinner where you know you're not wanted, and you bring good bourbon anyway, and none of it feels like much in the moment. It just feels like Tuesday. But it adds up. It becomes the architecture of who you are. And eventually, sometimes in a hallway you didn't expect, someone walks past and sees what you built. I didn't go to that dinner to prove anything. I went because Miles asked me to, and because my son's happiness was more important than my pride. That's a thing you learn if you're paying attention, that patience isn't weakness. Sitting quietly while a man tells you what you are isn't surrender. It's information gathering. It's the long game. 31 years of investigations taught me that the truth always surfaces eventually. You don't have to drag it up. You just have to still be in the room when it arrives. Miles texted me at midnight. 2 words. And I understood exactly what he meant, because what Ingrid had said yes to wasn't just the question Miles had asked her. She'd said yes to having a father-in-law who showed up even when it was uncomfortable, who kept his composure when it would have been easier not to, who understood that some fights aren't worth having and some are worth everything. I think about the men I put away over 31 years, not with satisfaction, more like a ledger. Actions, consequences. The ones who acted without thinking about what came after. The ones who couldn't imagine that the world extended beyond their own immediate certainty. Reginald wasn't one of those men. But he'd been close to becoming one, and that dining room before the hallway interrupted him. What I hope Miles takes from all of it, what I hope Ingrid takes, what I hope they carry into the life they're building together, is this: the quality of a person isn't in what they've accumulated. It's in what they do when they're wrong. Reginald looked at me across that table and said plainly that he owed me an apology. That took something real. That took the same thing it took to make the call to his attorney in 2007, a willingness to be uncomfortable in service of something true. That's the work. Not the building, not the title, not the size of the house, the willingness again and again to do the harder right thing instead of the easier wrong one. Miles already knows this. He's known it longer than he realizes.